They laughed when the poor single dad stepped into the executive elevator. In a building where every suit cost more than his entire month's rent, Daniel Carter stood there holding a worn metal toolbox, his work boots leaving faint dust on the polished marble floor of Langford Tower. The elevator doors slid shut with a soft chime, and a few sharply dressed executives glanced at him like he had wandered into the wrong world. One of them smirked. Another whispered something that triggered a quiet ripple of laughter. Daniel didn't react. He simply shifted his toolbox from one hand to the other and looked at the glowing floor numbers climbing higher. 42 stories above the city, the air smelled faintly of espresso and expensive perfume, and the low hum of the elevator motor echoed against the steel walls. Someone finally said it out loud. "Hey buddy, you realize this is the executive elevator, right?" A few chuckles followed. Daniel nodded politely, calm, almost absent-minded. Must have missed the sign. His voice was quiet, steady, the voice of someone used to working long hours in noisy places where words had to be simple to survive. The man in the navy suit scoffed. "Yeah, well, maintenance elevators are around the corner." Another executive pressed the emergency button to stop at the next floor, clearly eager to get the wrong man out of the wrong space. The elevator slowed. Then it stopped. The doors opened with a soft mechanical whisper. And that's when everything changed. Standing outside the elevator was Victoria Langford, the billionaire CEO, whose name sat at the very top of the glass tower. They were all standing inside. She stepped forward confidently, her heels clicking once against the polished floor, tablet in hand, eyes already scanning her morning schedule. But the moment she looked up and saw the man standing quietly inside the elevator, something happened no one in that building had ever seen before. Victoria Langford froze. Her tablet slipped from her fingers and hit the floor with a sharp crack that echoed through the elevator like a dropped glass in a silent room. Every executive inside straightened immediately, confused, nervous. No one spoke. No one moved. Because the most powerful woman in the building was staring at the quiet maintenance worker like she had just seen a ghost from another life. Daniel Carter looked back at her calmly, the same quiet expression on his face, as if none of this surprised him. 10 years earlier, in a small research lab at MIT, Daniel had been one of the brightest engineers in artificial intelligence, a man whose algorithms could solve problems most people couldn't even understand. And standing in that lab beside him back then had been a young intern named Victoria Langford, ambitious, brilliant, and terrified she wasn't good enough. The same woman now worth $12 billion. The same woman who whispered his name like a memory she never expected to see again. Daniel? And suddenly, the executives in the elevator realized something none of them were prepared for. The quiet single dad holding the old toolbox wasn't just a repairman who took the wrong elevator. He was the reason the empire around them existed. For a long moment, no one in the elevator breathed. The quiet hum of the cables above them sounded louder than before, like the building itself had paused to listen. Victoria Langford slowly bent down and picked up her tablet, but her eyes never left Daniel Carter. The executives glanced at one another, confused, trying to understand why the most powerful woman in the company looked shaken by a man holding an old toolbox. Daniel stood the same way he always did, calm, shoulders relaxed, the quiet posture of someone who had spent years fixing things that other people depended on. Victoria finally spoke again, her voice softer now, almost careful. "Daniel Carter, is that really you?" The name echoed through the elevator like a question no one else understood. One of the executives frowned slightly, whispering to the colleague beside him, but Daniel simply nodded once. "Yes, ma'am. It has been a while." The answer was polite and simple, but the room felt different after he said it. Victoria stepped inside the elevator slowly, the scent of cold morning air and city rain drifting in behind her. The doors closed with a gentle chime, and the elevator began to move again. No one dared to press another button. Victoria studied his face the way someone looks at an old photograph that suddenly comes to life. The gray at his temples had not been there 10 years ago. The quiet weight in his eyes had not been there either. But it was still the same Daniel Carter she remembered from a crowded research lab in Cambridge where late nights smelled like coffee and whiteboard markers. Back then he had been the one person in the room who never raised his voice, never tried to impress anyone, yet somehow solved problems faster than entire teams of engineers. She remembered the first time she had walked into that lab as a nervous graduate intern, carrying a laptop that barely worked and an idea everyone said would fail. Daniel had looked at her code for exactly 5 minutes before turning the screen back toward her and saying something she never forgot. The idea is not wrong. It just needs patience. Those 6 words had changed everything. Over the next 6 months, they worked side by side on an algorithm designed to predict market behavior using artificial intelligence. Investors laughed at the concept. Professors warned them it would never scale. But Daniel kept refining the model quietly, line by line, night after night. And one evening, long after most of the building lights had gone dark, the program finally worked. Victoria had built a company around that breakthrough. She had built an empire. Yet the man who made the foundation possible disappeared almost overnight. One day, he simply stopped coming to the lab. Emails went unanswered. His office desk was empty except for a single handwritten note thanking the team. No explanation. No goodbye. For 10 years, Victoria had wondered what happened to him. Now the answer stood in front of her wearing work boots and holding a maintenance toolbox. The elevator stopped again with a soft ding as it reached the executive floor. No one moved at first. The executives looked from Victoria to Daniel, waiting for direction the way employees always do when power is present. Victoria finally spoke, but her voice carried something new now. Respect. Daniel, she said quietly, what are you doing here? Daniel glanced down at the toolbox in his hand, then back up with a faint, tired smile. Air conditioning repair. Someone said the system on the 42nd floor stopped working. The executives stared in stunned silence. Because suddenly the most valuable technology company in the building had a broken cooling system. And the man who built the company's first algorithm had just arrived to fix the air conditioner. The silence inside the executive hallway lingered even after the elevator doors opened. The executives stepped out slowly, but their eyes remained fixed on Daniel Carter, as if they were trying to solve a puzzle that suddenly made no sense. Victoria Langford remained beside him for a moment longer before walking forward, her heels tapping softly against the polished floor of the 42nd level. Through the glass walls of the corridor, the city stretched for miles, morning sunlight reflecting off towers and traffic far below. Normally, this floor buzzed with quiet conversations, financial forecasts, and the steady rhythm of billion-dollar decisions. But today the energy felt different. People noticed the CEO walking beside a maintenance worker carrying an old toolbox. Heads turned. Conversations paused. Daniel did not seem to notice. He simply followed the building map on the wall and stopped near a large vent above the conference wing where warm air drifted slowly into the hallway. He set the toolbox down and opened it with the calm routine of someone who had done this hundreds of times. Screwdrivers, a small flashlight, a folded measuring tape, everything arranged neatly despite years of use. One of the executives finally spoke, unable to contain the confusion any longer. Victoria, should we call building services for this? His tone carried the polite caution of someone unsure whether a mistake had just been made. Victoria looked at him briefly, then back at Daniel. He is building services, she answered quietly. The hallway fell silent again. Daniel climbed a short maintenance ladder position near the vent and removed the metal panel with careful movements. Warm air rushed out as he examined the inside of the duct. The faint hum of the building ventilation echoed above them. Victoria stood a few feet away watching him work, her expression thoughtful, almost distant. 10 years of questions pressed quietly in her mind. Finally she spoke again. You disappeared. Daniel continued adjusting a small valve inside the duct before answering. Life changed. The words were simple, but they carried a weight that made even the executives listening nearby grow quiet. Victoria stepped closer. You did not answer any messages. The lab tried to find you. I tried to find you. Daniel paused for a second before tightening the final screw and stepping down from the ladder. The warm air flow from the vent softened immediately, the temperature in the hallway beginning to stabilize. He closed the toolbox calmly before meeting her eyes again. My wife got sick, he said gently. After she passed away, my daughter needed someone more than the lab did. The explanation was quiet, but it landed like a truth no one in that hallway expected. Victoria lowered her gaze for a moment. In all the financial reports, investor meetings, and global conferences that filled the last decade of her life, she had never heard that part of his story. Daniel lifted the toolbox again, preparing to move toward the next maintenance unit further down the hall. But before he could take another step, a voice from behind them spoke with sudden disbelief. It was one of the senior board members who had quietly arrived during the conversation. He looked at Daniel, then at Victoria, his expression stunned. "Wait a second," he said slowly. "Are you telling me this man is the Daniel Carter who wrote the predictive algorithm our entire platform runs on?" The question hung in the air like a spark waiting to ignite. Every executive in the hallway turned toward Victoria. She did not hesitate this time. Her answer was calm, clear, and impossible to misunderstand. "Yes," she said. "The company you all work for exists because of him." And in that moment, the maintenance worker holding the old toolbox suddenly looked very different to everyone in the room. The words settled over the hallway like a sudden shift in gravity. For several seconds, no one spoke. The executives who had laughed earlier in the elevator now stared at Daniel Carter with completely different expressions, the kind people where when a simple story suddenly becomes much bigger than they expected. The senior board member who asked the question blinked twice, as if trying to process the information. "The Daniel Carter?" he repeated slowly. Victoria Langford nodded once, calm and certain. "The original architect of the predictive engine. The one that became the foundation of Langford Analytics." The man exhaled quietly, glancing at Daniel again, this time with unmistakable respect. Around them, the quiet hallway seemed to hold its breath. Daniel shifted the toolbox slightly in his hand, as though none of this attention belonged to him. "It was a long time ago," he said gently. His voice carried no pride, only a quiet acceptance of the past. But the executives knew exactly what that algorithm meant. That program now processed financial predictions for companies across the country, analyzing millions of data points every hour. It powered investment strategies, market forecasts, and global logistics models. It was the engine behind a company valued at more than $12 billion. And the man who first wrote it was standing in front of them, wearing work boots and a maintenance uniform. One of the younger executives finally stepped forward, curiosity overcoming hesitation. Why would someone who built something like that walk away? Daniel looked down the hallway where sunlight spilled through the glass walls, the city far below moving with its usual morning rhythm. For a moment he did not answer. Then he spoke quietly. "Because some things matter more than technology." Victoria watched him carefully. She had spent years telling investors that the company's success came from innovation, from data, from relentless progress. Yet the man who created its most important breakthrough had left without hesitation. "Your daughter," she said softly, remembering the words he had spoken earlier. Daniel nodded once. "Her name is Lily. She was 5 when her mother passed away." The world suddenly felt smaller after that. The executives listened without interrupting. The explanation was simple, but the meaning behind it was impossible to ignore. Daniel continued calmly. "When someone depends on you that way, the rest of the world becomes noise." The hallway grew even quieter. Victoria folded her arms slowly, thoughtful. For 10 years she had wondered if Daniel left because of disappointment, because of conflict, because someone had forced him out. She had never imagined the answer was something so human. One of the board members cleared his throat gently. "Mr. Carter, if you had stayed, you would probably be sitting in this building's top office today." Daniel smiled faintly, the kind of smile that appears when someone has already made peace with their decisions. "Maybe," he said, "but my daughter would not remember her father being there." The words carried a quiet dignity that no one could argue with. Victoria looked at him for a long moment before speaking again. "Daniel, do you know how many engineers we have tried to hire over the last decade, hoping to recreate the intuition you wrote into that system?" Daniel shrugged lightly. The code was never really about intuition. It was about patience. The same word he had once spoken in the lab years ago. Victoria remembered it instantly. The hallway felt different now. No one saw a maintenance worker anymore. They saw the quiet mind behind the company's greatest achievement. Daniel picked up the ladder and folded it carefully, preparing to move toward the next unit down the corridor. But Victoria spoke before he could leave. Her voice carried authority again, but now there was something else beneath it. Something personal. "Daniel," she said, "after everything you built, do you really plan to walk out of this building today like none of it ever happened?" And for the first time since he arrived, Daniel Carter hesitated before answering. Daniel Carter did not answer immediately. The quiet hallway seemed to stretch around him as sunlight reflected softly off the glass walls and polished floor. For a moment, he simply looked down at the toolbox in his hand, the metal edges worn smooth from years of work. The executives waited. Victoria Langford waited. Finally Daniel spoke, his voice calm but thoughtful. I never expected to walk back into this building at all. The statement carried a quiet honesty that made the room feel smaller. Victoria stepped closer, her expression no longer the confident mask she wore in board meetings. This was different. This was personal history standing in front of her. Daniel, you built the heart of this company, she said carefully. Every system we run still carries the structure you designed. Daniel gave a small, almost amused smile. Technology grows. People improve it. That is how progress works. One of the executives could not help speaking again. With respect, that system still processes over 40 million data decisions every hour. Another added quietly, most engineers here study your early design like it is a textbook. Daniel looked slightly surprised by that. He shook his head gently. I was just solving a problem. Victoria studied his face for a long moment, remembering the quiet nights in the lab when the world outside had not mattered. Back then, Daniel never cared about recognition. He cared about getting the answer right. She spoke again, her voice softer now. You left before you saw what it became. Daniel leaned the folded ladder against the wall and closed the final latch on his toolbox. I saw enough, he said calmly. Once the model proved it could learn on its own, the rest was inevitable. The confidence in that statement reminded everyone in the hallway why his work had been so extraordinary. Victoria folded her arms slowly, considering him. You are telling me you walked away from something that now supports thousands of jobs and influences global markets. Daniel nodded once. Yes. The executives exchanged glances again, still struggling to understand how someone could step away from that level of impact. Victoria took a slow breath. Then help me understand something. Daniel looked at her, patient as always. Why come back today? Daniel glanced up at the ceiling vent he had repaired earlier, then down the long corridor where another maintenance unit waited at the far end. Because the building called a service company, he said with a faint smile. A few quiet laughs escaped from the group, easing the tension for the first time. Victoria shook her head slightly, half amused and half amazed. After 10 years you return here with a toolbox instead of a laptop. Daniel lifted the toolbox a little. Both fixed systems, he replied. The simplicity of the answer made several executives smile. But Victoria did not smile right away. She was thinking about something deeper. The company had spent millions recruiting the best engineers in the country. They had built laboratories, research centers, innovation teams. Yet the mind that started everything had been working quietly in a completely different life. Victoria finally spoke again, her tone thoughtful but firm. Daniel, I do not believe in coincidences. Daniel tilted his head slightly. Neither do I. Victoria looked down the hallway, then back at him with a decision forming behind her eyes. Then perhaps you did not take the wrong elevator today. The executives watched the exchange carefully. Something important was unfolding in front of them. Daniel studied her expression, sensing the shift in the conversation. What are you suggesting? He asked calmly. Victoria did not hesitate this time. I am suggesting that the man who built the foundation of this company should not be leaving the building through the service exit. The hallway fell quiet again as everyone waited to hear what she would say next. Daniel Carter studied Victoria Langford for a moment after her words settled in the quiet hallway. The sunlight outside the glass walls shifted slightly as clouds moved across the sky, casting long reflections across the polished floor. For 10 years he had lived a life where moments like this simply did not exist. His days usually began before sunrise in a small apartment on the edge of the city where the sound of early traffic drifted through the kitchen window. He would make breakfast for his daughter Lily, pack her school lunch, and walk her to the bus stop before starting a long day repairing heating and cooling systems across office buildings and small businesses. It was a quiet life, a simple life, and Daniel had never regretted choosing it. Now he stood inside one of the tallest buildings in the city with executives watching him as if he had stepped out of a history book. Victoria's voice broke the silence again. Daniel, you changed the direction of an entire industry and you walked away from it like it was just another chapter. Daniel adjusted the handle of his toolbox slowly. Because it was, he answered calmly. The executives exchanged glances again. For them, the company was a constant race toward growth, influence, and innovation. For Daniel, it had been something much simpler. A problem that needed solving. Victoria shook her head slightly, not in disagreement, but in disbelief at how different his perspective was. Most people would spend their entire lives trying to build what you built in 2 years. Daniel smiled faintly. Most people would not have had the team we had in that lab. The humility in his voice was genuine. Victoria remembered those nights clearly. Daniel had always spoken about ideas as if they belonged to everyone in the room, even when the breakthrough was clearly his. She stepped closer, lowering her voice slightly, so the conversation felt less like a boardroom discussion and more like two people remembering a shared past. The world moved on without you, she said softly. But the system you created never stopped learning. Daniel nodded thoughtfully. That was always the goal. Victoria studied him again, noticing details she had missed earlier. The lines near his eyes suggested years of responsibility. The steady calm in his posture suggested someone who had faced challenges far greater than corporate pressure. She spoke again, curiosity mixing with admiration. Tell me something honestly. Do you ever miss it? The research, the discovery, the moment when a solution finally appears after weeks of work. Daniel looked toward the wide window at the end of the hallway where the skyline stretched for miles. Cars moved slowly along the streets far below, tiny and distant from this height. Sometimes, he admitted. But life gives you different puzzles. Victoria tilted her head slightly, raising Lily. Daniel's smile grew warmer this time. Exactly. The executives listening nearby remained silent, sensing that this conversation had moved beyond business. Victoria took a slow breath, then made a decision that shifted the tone of the entire room. Daniel, the company you helped start has a research division that now spans 3 continents. We have engineers who spend years studying the logic you wrote in those first lines of code. Daniel listened patiently. Victoria continued, her voice calm but filled with conviction. And I believe the person who started that journey deserves the chance to see where it led. Daniel looked at her thoughtfully. You are offering me a tour? A small smile appeared on Victoria's face. I am offering you the opportunity to walk through the front doors of your own legacy. The hallway fell quiet again as everyone waited for Daniel Carter to decide whether he was ready to step back into a world he left behind a decade earlier. Daniel Carter did not answer right away. The hallway remained quiet except for the faint hum of the building ventilation system he had just repaired. Through the tall glass windows, the morning sun reflected off the river that cut through the city, casting a soft glow across the executive floor. Daniel looked down at the toolbox in his hand, then back at Victoria Langford. For a man who had once spent nights solving complex algorithms, the decision in front of him now felt strangely simple and complicated at the same time. Victoria watched him carefully. She had seen this expression before many years ago in the research lab, when Daniel was thinking through a difficult problem. He never rushed an answer. He waited until the right one appeared. Finally, Daniel spoke. Victoria, the world you built here is impressive. Anyone can see that. His voice carried genuine respect. The executives listening nearby straightened slightly, proud of the company they helped grow. But Daniel continued calmly. But I am not the same person who worked in that lab. Victoria folded her arms, listening. People change, she said. Daniel nodded slowly. Yes, they do. He looked toward the large window again, where the city stretched for miles. 10 years ago, I believed the most important thing in the world was solving the next problem, making the next breakthrough, watching an idea turn into something that could change how people live. His words were thoughtful, reflective. Victoria recognized the passion that once drove him. Then Daniel looked back at her. But life has a way of rewriting priorities. Victoria spoke gently. Your daughter. Daniel's expression softened immediately. Lily. He paused for a moment before continuing. When her mother passed away, Lily stopped talking for nearly 3 months. She was only 5 years old. Every morning, she would sit at the kitchen table and stare at the empty chair where her mother used to drink coffee. The executives remained silent, the story unfolding in a way none of them expected. Daniel continued quietly. During that time, the lab kept calling. Investors wanted updates. The project was gaining attention. Everyone believed the work we started could become something extraordinary. He gave a faint smile. They were right. Victoria listened without interrupting. Daniel's voice grew softer but steadier. But every evening, when I came home, Lily would sit beside me on the couch and hold my hand like she was afraid I might disappear too. The hallway felt even quieter now. And I realized something important, Daniel said. Some problems are more important than algorithms. Victoria lowered her gaze slightly, understanding exactly what he meant. Daniel continued. So I chose the puzzle that mattered most. Helping my daughter feel safe again. The executives glanced at each other. The story carried a kind of strength none of them could measure in financial terms. Victoria finally spoke again. And now? Daniel shrugged lightly. Now Lily is 15. She talks more than I do. She loves science, and she thinks her father fixing air conditioners is the most normal thing in the world. A few quiet smiles appeared among the executives. Victoria studied him again with renewed curiosity. Does she know who you used to be? Daniel shook his head gently. To her, I am just Dad. The simplicity of the answer hung in the air. Victoria considered that for a moment before speaking again. Daniel, the world may see a maintenance worker standing in this hallway. She gestured around the executive floor. But I see the man who helped create the future this building depends on. Daniel looked at her thoughtfully. And what exactly are you asking me to do about that? Victoria met his eyes with calm certainty. I am asking you to walk with me for 15 minutes and see what your idea became. She paused slightly before adding one more sentence that changed the atmosphere in the hallway once again. After that, if you still want to leave with your toolbox, I will personally walk you to the elevator. Daniel Carter looked at Victoria Langford for several quiet seconds after she made her offer. The executives nearby did not move, sensing that this moment carried more weight than any meeting scheduled on their calendars that morning. Outside the wide windows, the city continued its usual rhythm. Cars flowing through intersections far below and sunlight reflecting off the river. But inside the hallway, everything felt suspended between past and present. Daniel finally let out a slow breath and nodded once. 15 minutes, he said calmly. Victoria's expression softened slightly, the smallest hint of relief crossing her face. That is all I ask. She turned toward the corridor leading deeper into the executive wing. This way. The group began walking together, the quiet echo of footsteps following them across the polished floor. Daniel carried his toolbox beside him as naturally as if he were moving through any other building on his daily repair route. Yet the people around him now walked with a kind of quiet awareness, understanding they were accompanying someone whose ideas had quietly shaped their entire company. They passed through a set of glass doors that opened into the main research floor. The atmosphere changed immediately. Instead of boardroom silence, the space hummed with focused activity. Large digital displays lined the walls showing streams of real-time data, predictive graphs shifting second by second, complex models analyzing financial and logistical patterns across the country. Engineers worked at long desks filled with monitors, their screens glowing with lines of code and dynamic visualizations. Victoria slowed slightly as they entered. This is the Central Analytics Laboratory, she explained. The system you designed has grown into a network that processes information from more than 80 global markets every minute. Daniel studied the room with quiet interest. The structure of the platform was still familiar to him, even though the technology around it had advanced dramatically. One of the engineers nearby noticed Victoria and stood up quickly. Good morning, he said, then paused when he saw Daniel standing beside her. Victoria gestured toward a large display at the center of the room, where a complex predictive map rotated slowly across the screen. This visualization runs on the original learning architecture you created, she said. Every update we built still follows the same foundation. Daniel stepped closer to the display, the light from the screen reflecting in his eyes as he examined the patterns. You improved the training speed, he observed after a moment. The engineer blinked in surprise. Yes, we redesigned the optimization layer last year. Daniel nodded thoughtfully. Good decision. The early version struggled with large data sets. Victoria glanced at the engineers who were now watching Daniel with growing curiosity. They were beginning to understand who this quiet visitor might be. She continued speaking as they moved toward another workstation. The system now helps hospitals predict supply shortages, assists shipping companies in routing millions of deliveries, and supports financial risk models used by hundreds of organizations. Daniel listened quietly. None of it sounded like the ambitious headlines investors used when describing the company. Instead, it sounded like a collection of problems being solved, one after another, just like the nights in the old lab. Victoria stopped beside a glass wall overlooking the entire research floor. All of this started with an idea you wrote on a whiteboard in Cambridge, she said softly. Daniel looked across the room at the teams working together beneath the soft glow of monitors and overhead lights. The scale of it was far larger than the small research project he remembered. For the first time since entering the building, he seemed genuinely surprised. Victoria noticed the change immediately. You see it now, she said quietly. Daniel nodded slowly. I see people solving problems. Victoria smiled faintly. Exactly. She looked at him again, her voice calm but sincere. And they have been building on your work for 10 years. The engineers across the room had begun whispering to one another, piecing together the truth about the quiet man standing beside the CEO. Daniel stood silently for a moment longer, absorbing the scene before speaking again. You were right, he said thoughtfully. Victoria tilted her head slightly. About what? Daniel glanced around the research floor one more time. It was worth seeing. Daniel Carter stood quietly beside the glass wall overlooking the research floor while engineers moved between glowing monitors and shifting data models. The soft hum of servers filled the air like a distant engine powering the entire building. For several seconds, he simply watched the screens update in real time, the predictive models adjusting themselves with each new stream of information. Victoria Langford studied his expression carefully, trying to read what he was thinking. You always said the system should learn from the world instead of forcing the world to fit the system, she said gently. Daniel nodded slightly without looking away from the displays. Because the world is always more complicated than any model we write. One of the engineers standing nearby finally stepped forward with curiosity he could no longer hide. He was a young man in his late 20s wearing a badge that read Senior Data Analyst. Excuse me, he said carefully, glancing at Victoria for confirmation. She nodded once. Go ahead. The engineer looked back at Daniel with growing excitement. Are you the Daniel Carter who designed the original adaptive prediction framework? Daniel turned toward him with a calm smile. I helped start it. The engineer shook his head in amazement. We studied your architecture during my graduate program. Our professors said it changed how machine learning systems approach uncertainty. Daniel looked genuinely surprised by that. It was just an experiment at the time. Victoria gave a small laugh. An experiment that became the backbone of a $12 billion company. The engineers around the room had begun paying closer attention now, quietly piecing together the identity of the man standing beside the CEO. Daniel shifted his toolbox slightly, as if reminding himself why he came to the building in the first place. I should probably finish the rest of the maintenance check before your climate system fails again, he said calmly. Victoria did not move. Daniel, she said softly, look around you one more time. Daniel glanced across the room again. Teams of engineers collaborated at shared workstations while the massive display wall continued to update with new predictions every second. Somewhere inside the system, he could still recognize the mathematical structure he had written years ago, but it had evolved far beyond the small research project he once knew. Victoria stepped beside him near the glass wall. Do you know how many companies tried to build systems like this after we launched? She asked quietly. Daniel shrugged lightly. Many, I imagine. Victoria nodded. Most of them failed. Daniel finally looked directly at her. Because they tried to force the answers instead of letting the model learn. Victoria smiled slightly. Exactly what you said in the lab. For a moment the two of them stood silently watching the research floor below. Then Victoria spoke again, her voice calm but filled with something deeper than professional respect. Daniel, the truth is this company never stopped looking for you. Daniel raised an eyebrow slightly. Why? Victoria answered without hesitation. Because every breakthrough we made started with the foundation you left behind. Daniel looked thoughtful but not convinced. You built the rest of it. Victoria shook her head gently. We expanded it. But the first idea was yours. The engineer who had spoken earlier looked between them with amazement. Sir, if you ever wanted to return to research here, the entire team would learn more in 1 month than we usually do in a year. Daniel gave a quiet chuckle at that. I appreciate the compliment. He closed the lid of his toolbox again and lifted it from the floor. Victoria watched the movement carefully. You are still planning to leave, she said. Daniel nodded calmly. My daughter finishes school at 3:30. I promised I would pick her up today. The answer was simple, but it carried the same quiet priority he had spoken about earlier. Victoria studied him for a moment before responding. Then perhaps we should continue this conversation somewhere else. Daniel tilted his head slightly. Where? Victoria's expression softened with an unexpected warmth. Over dinner. Daniel Carter paused for a moment after Victoria Langford suggested dinner. The research floor behind them continued its quiet rhythm, screens shifting with data and engineers moving between workstations, but the conversation between the two of them had become something separate from the busy room. Daniel adjusted the handle of his toolbox and gave a small, thoughtful smile. Dinner sounds like a luxury I have not scheduled today, he said calmly. Victoria crossed her arms lightly, studying him with the same patient curiosity she once had in the research lab years ago. You scheduled time to repair an air conditioning system in a building you helped create, she replied. I believe you can schedule dinner. One of the engineers nearby quietly smiled at that exchange before returning to his workstation, sensing that the moment belonged to them. Daniel looked toward the large display wall again, where the predictive models continued learning from thousands of incoming signals. It is impressive, he admitted. Victoria nodded. It is also incomplete. Daniel raised an eyebrow slightly. Incomplete. Victoria turned and began walking slowly toward a quieter corner of the research floor where a long window overlooked the river cutting through the city. Daniel followed beside her, toolbox still in hand. Every system reaches a limit eventually, she explained. We expanded the architecture. We improved the training efficiency. But there are parts of the model that still behave exactly the way you designed them 10 years ago. Daniel leaned slightly against the window frame, listening. Which means those parts still work. Victoria smiled faintly. They work. But they also raise questions our current engineers cannot always answer. Daniel looked curious now. Questions about what? Victoria glanced toward the large digital displays behind them. About why certain patterns appear before major changes in the market. About how the system recognizes weak signals long before analysts see them. Daniel thought for a moment. That was the entire point of the learning layer. Victoria nodded. Yes, but you never finished explaining how you trained it to recognize those signals. Daniel gave a small quiet laugh. Because I was still figuring it out myself. Victoria leaned against the glass beside him. And then you left. Daniel looked down at the city traffic flowing below. Life interrupted the experiment. Victoria's voice softened slightly. Experiments can be continued. Daniel shook his head gently. My daughter might disagree with that. Victoria watched him for a moment before speaking again. What if continuing the experiment did not take you away from her? Daniel turned toward her, clearly interested now. What do you mean? Victoria spoke carefully. Our research team works flexible hours. Remote collaboration is possible from almost anywhere. You could contribute without leaving your life behind. Daniel considered the idea quietly. The engineers working across the room continued their conversations, unaware that the direction of the company might be shifting only a few steps away from them. Victoria, Daniel said thoughtfully, I have spent the last decade building a life that fits around Lily. I cannot risk turning that life upside down. Victoria nodded with understanding. I am not asking you to change that life. She paused before continuing. I am asking if you would be willing to share what you already know. Daniel looked at the research floor once more, then back at her. Over dinner, he said slowly, repeating her earlier suggestion. Victoria smiled. Exactly. Daniel lifted his toolbox slightly. Then I should finish the rest of the maintenance inspection first. Victoria laughed softly for the first time since their conversation began. Of course you should. Daniel started toward the hallway leading back to the maintenance corridor, but before he reached the door, Victoria spoke one more time. Daniel. He stopped and turned back. Yes. Victoria's voice carried a quiet sincerity now. I am very glad you took the wrong elevator this morning. Daniel thought about that for a moment before answering with the same calm tone he had used all day. So am I. Daniel Carter spent the next 20 minutes finishing the maintenance inspection across the executive floor with the same quiet focus he had shown since arriving at the building. He checked the final ventilation unit near the conference hall, adjusted a temperature regulator, and secured the panel with careful precision. For him, the work was simple and familiar, the kind of routine problem-solving that kept systems running quietly in the background while the world above them continued its business. When he finally closed his toolbox and stepped back into the main corridor, the hallway looked very different from the moment he first arrived. Earlier that morning, executives had watched him with polite confusion, unsure why a maintenance worker had appeared on their floor. Now several of them nodded respectfully as he walked past, fully aware of who he was. Victoria Langford stood near the elevator waiting for him, reviewing something briefly on her tablet before looking up. "Finished?" she asked. Daniel nodded. "The system should run smoothly now." Victoria placed the tablet aside. "Good. That means you still have time before 3:30. Daniel checked the small watch on his wrist and gave a faint smile. "Barely." Victoria pressed the elevator button and the doors opened with a soft chime. They stepped inside together, this time without the curious laughter or whispers that had filled the space earlier. The elevator began descending slowly through the tower while sunlight streamed through the narrow glass panel in the door. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Victoria broke the silence. "You never told me what Lily wants to do after high school." Daniel leaned lightly against the rail beside him. "She says she wants to design spacecraft." Victoria raised an eyebrow with interest. "That sounds ambitious." Daniel nodded proudly. "She spends half her weekends reading about propulsion systems and orbital mechanics." Victoria smiled slightly. "Then she definitely inherited something from you." Daniel chuckled quietly. "I try not to influence her too much. Curiosity grows better on its own." The elevator stopped at the lobby level, and the doors opened to the wide marble entrance hall of the building. People moved through the space carrying laptops and coffee cups, the steady rhythm of a busy workday continuing as usual. Yet a few employees glanced toward Victoria and Daniel with quiet curiosity. The CEO rarely walked through the lobby during business hours, especially not beside someone carrying a maintenance toolbox. Victoria gestured toward the exit doors that opened onto the street. "There is a small restaurant 2 blocks away. It is quiet, and the chef there understands that sometimes people need space to think." Daniel followed her outside into the crisp afternoon air where the sounds of traffic and city life replaced the quiet hum of the tower. As they walked along the sidewalk, Daniel noticed the tall glass building reflecting the sky above them. 10 years earlier, he had never imagined that a project started on a whiteboard would grow into something that touched so many lives. Victoria noticed him looking back at the tower. "Regrets?" she asked gently. Daniel shook his head. "No," he paused before continuing. "Just curiosity." Victoria smiled. "That is exactly what I was hoping to hear." They reached the small restaurant and stepped inside where soft light and the quiet murmur of conversation filled the room. As they sat down at a corner table, Daniel placed his toolbox beside the chair. The waitress approached with menus, but Victoria waved gently. "We will need a little time." When the waitress walked away, Victoria looked across the table at him with calm sincerity. "Daniel, today started with a broken air conditioning unit." She paused slightly before finishing the thought. "But I think something much more important just restarted." The restaurant was quiet in the early afternoon, the kind of place where conversations unfolded slowly and the noise of the city faded into a soft background murmur. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows beside their table, reflecting gently off the polished wood surface. Daniel Carter sat across from Victoria Langford with his toolbox resting beside his chair, an unusual companion in a room filled with business lunches and quiet meetings. For a moment, neither of them spoke as the waitress placed 2 glasses of water on the table and stepped away. Daniel glanced briefly at the clock on the wall, then back at Victoria. "You mentioned the system still raises questions," he said calmly. Victoria nodded and opened her tablet, turning the screen toward him. A series of complex graphs appeared, moving slowly as predictive signals adjusted across several markets. "Over the last 2 years, we started noticing patterns the system predicts days before analysts can explain them," she said. Daniel leaned forward slightly, studying the display with the quiet focus that once defined his nights in the research lab. "Weak signals," he said after a moment. Victoria nodded again. "Exactly. Our engineers see the results, but they do not always understand how the model identifies those signals so early." Daniel considered the data thoughtfully. The learning layer adapts to small irregularities long before humans notice them. It was designed to pay attention to patterns that look insignificant. Victoria watched his expression carefully. "Which means the system is still learning the way you intended." Daniel looked up from the screen. "That was the idea. A system that stays curious." Victoria smiled faintly at that word. "Curiosity is something you seem to understand better than most people." Daniel leaned back in his chair, thoughtful but relaxed. "Curiosity is the beginning of every discovery." The waitress returned briefly to take their order before leaving them again with quiet privacy. Outside the window, the afternoon traffic moved steadily along the street, the rhythm of the city continuing without pause. Victoria rested her hands lightly on the table. Daniel, the engineers in that building believe the system reached its current limits, she said. But I do not think it has. Daniel looked interested. Why not? Victoria tapped the tablet screen again, revealing another set of predictive models adjusting across several industries. Because the architecture you built was never meant to stop learning. Daniel studied the graphs for another moment before responding. No system should stop learning. That is how intelligence works. Victoria nodded. Which means the next stage of the system might require the same mind that designed the first stage. Daniel gave a quiet laugh. You are very determined. Victoria did not deny it. I have spent 10 years building a company around an idea that started with you. Daniel looked down at the glass of water in front of him, thoughtful. And you succeeded. Victoria shook her head gently. We succeeded. But the system is still asking questions we cannot answer. Daniel rested his hands on the table, considering her words carefully. And you believe I might know the answers. Victoria met his eyes calmly. I believe you might ask the right questions. The difference between those two ideas hung in the air for a moment. Daniel finally smiled. That sounds like the beginning of another experiment. Victoria's expression warmed. Exactly. Daniel glanced again at the clock on the wall, then back at her. I still need to pick up my daughter at 3:30. Victoria nodded without hesitation. Then we should finish lunch before then. Daniel closed the tablet gently and slid it back toward her. All right, he said calmly. Tell me what your system has been trying to learn for the past 10 years. The afternoon sunlight shifted gently across the table as Daniel Carter and Victoria Langford finished their conversation. Plates had been cleared away, and the quiet restaurant had begun to fill with the soft murmur of other diners arriving for late lunch. Daniel glanced once more at the clock on the wall before standing and lifting his toolbox beside the chair. I should go, he said calmly. Lily will be waiting. Victoria stood as well, her expression thoughtful but warm. Of course. They stepped outside together into the bright city afternoon where the streets moved with the steady rhythm of traffic and pedestrians. For a moment, they both looked back at the glass tower rising above the skyline. Daniel spoke first. You built something remarkable in there. Victoria shook her head gently. We built it. Daniel smiled faintly, but did not argue. Some things did not need to be debated. They walked together along the sidewalk for a short distance until they reached the corner where Daniel's work truck was parked. The vehicle was older but well cared for, the back filled with tools and spare parts for the systems he repaired every day. Daniel placed the toolbox inside and closed the door. Victoria leaned lightly against the side of the truck, watching him with quiet curiosity. Do you know what surprised me most today? She asked. Daniel looked at her. What is that? Victoria smiled slightly. You walked into the most advanced analytics company in the country carrying a maintenance toolbox, and you never once acted like you owned any of it. Daniel considered that for a moment. Because I do not, he said simply. Victoria shook her head again with a quiet laugh. You really have not changed. Daniel leaned lightly against the truck door. People rarely change as much as the world around them does. For a moment they both stood in the warm afternoon air, the city sounds moving around them like a quiet soundtrack to the day. Victoria spoke again, her tone thoughtful. When the system started predicting patterns no one could explain, I kept thinking about something you once said in the lab. Daniel looked curious. What did I say? Victoria smiled as she remembered. You said intelligence does not come from knowing the answer. It comes from knowing how to keep asking the question. Daniel nodded slowly. That still sounds right. Victoria folded her arms lightly. Then perhaps the next question belongs to both of us. Daniel glanced toward the street where the traffic light changed and cars began moving again. Maybe, he said calmly. But the next few hours belong to my daughter. Victoria's smile grew warmer. That might be the most important system you ever built. Daniel opened the driver door and paused before getting inside. Victoria, he said quietly. She looked at him. Yes. Daniel gestured toward the towering glass building behind them. Take good care of it. Victoria followed his gaze to the tower where sunlight reflected across its windows. I will, she said softly. Daniel nodded once, climbed into the truck, and started the engine. As he drove away into the afternoon traffic, Victoria remained standing on the sidewalk for a moment longer, watching the truck disappear into the city streets. Around her the world continued as usual, But something inside the quiet rhythm of the day had shifted. Because sometimes the most important person in the room is not the one with the title or the office at the top of the building. Sometimes it is the quiet single father who chooses dignity over recognition and still leaves behind an idea powerful enough to change the world.